Jonathan Glazer's art house film Under the Skin was polarizing at its release and remains so to this day. Its critic score on Rotten Tomatoes sits at a strong 84%, whilst the audience score sinks to a measly 55%. One of the reasons for this is undoubtedly that the film poses more questions than it answers, but maybe here delivering answers isn't as important as the execution of its ideas. The film tackles an avalanche of concepts: what it means to be human, how our experiences shape our identity, themes of sexuality, existentialism, gender roles, consumption, violence, and more, many of which are explored through visual symbols. For example, eyes feature significantly throughout the film. The opening scene, Laura's creation, focuses on her assembly through her eyes, which are later scrutinized for empathy by the man on the motorcycle. Laura's eyes are a medium for her journey throughout the film, going first from a simple tool for observation to an awakened lens for emotion. And beyond Under the Skin symbols, the aesthetics, the performances, and the ambiguity all play a role in its achievement of something unique. And all of this is delivered despite a straightforward and uncomplicated plot. Laura is an otherworldly being created for the sole purpose of luring and consuming men. But as she observes and then experiences what it is to be human, her apathy turns to curiosity and then yearning, which becomes the basis of communicating the movie's themes. But there's a red thread that brings an elevated cohesion to this work of art: Mica Levi's brilliantly unsettling score. The film's musical language is crafted and executed with such depth that it functions as a standalone storytelling device, both evoking emotion and serving as a narrative voice for the film's subtext, and this is what I want to focus on. The film begins with Laura's creation, which is more reminiscent of an assembly than a birth. It's fair to say that she's an alien construct, not an alien being, per se. She's unaware of her own nature, a tool created with a unique purpose. And that purpose begins with the visual identification of her prey, so it makes sense that the opening scene focuses on her eyes. The opening score features rapid, unrelenting tremolos, which are akin to the inner workings of a hornet's nest. There's a dense pressure to this sound, which returns in scenes where alien nature is center stage. For example, when we discover what happens to Laura's victims, or when she's chased by one of her own. And this pressure extends to Laura herself, crushingly emphasizing that there is no room for questions. She is a construct, not a being, and the soundtrack reminds her of this, turning antagonistic as the film progresses. If there's one song you remember from the film, it's probably this one. Its rhythmic, distorted drums and unpredictable strings are resoundingly unsettling, each gritty note expressing otherness and trepidation. The song conveys the inevitability and the consistency of Laura's seduction scenes. And the effect for the audience is that despite the graphic nudity, these scenes aren't sexual in nature, but instead disturbing. The hypnotic walk and detached stare invoke a primal sense of fear above all else, perhaps due to their performative falseness, echoed in how the song is constructed. It's interesting that a version of this song also plays during one of my favorite scenes, which takes place at the beach. Laura passively witnesses a terrifying drowning and a failed rescue attempt. This is the first moment in the film where Laura observes empathy, here from the swimmer, but she isn't equipped to process it, and so her violent reaction seems nonsensical, which is where the song begins. Laura kills the swimmer, but it's unclear why. Is she behaving in accordance with her programming, or perhaps trying to help him? Why drag the body across the beach, and for that matter, why do anything at all? Her jarring apathy for the abandoned baby shows how far detached she is from the human experience, and yet her actions communicate a curiosity, or at the very least, an interest. The creeping, seductive soundtrack supports this notion, only this time it's working on her. And with time, Laura begins to experience more of the depth of human behavior. At first it's foreign and overwhelming, like the nightclub scene, which is a complete sensory overload. But with time, even her stalking becomes intercut with more candid observing, for example focusing not just on young men, but women or the elderly. This change is confirmed when she's examined by the man on the motorcycle, who scrutinizes her eyes for a sign of humanity with intensity. This moment unambiguously tells us that for the aliens, eyes are a sort of litmus test for empathy, any sign of which would be a critical flaw in their design. The score here captures the friction between the two characters nicely, juxtaposing the tremolos of creation and the rhythmic drumming of Lipstick to Void. The performance in the scene is apathetic, but the sound conveys the tension. And it's immediately after this encounter that Laura has a real emotional breakthrough. When Laura falls over in the city's crowded streets, she has her first direct experience with kindness. The instinctively human reaction to help someone up causes an intense introspection and re-examination of everything she has observed thus far. Visually, this is achieved first by focusing on her eye, of course, and then the progressive layering of what she's observed, until we arrive at a golden, abstract, almost spiritual-looking frame. And coupled with this overwhelming visual, we hear the first piece of music that feels warm, and it holds enough illustrative depth to capture what's really happening. Just as her image is juxtaposed on her observations, the song plays with the idea of what's fake and what's real. There's a falseness to playing strings on a synthesizer. A note, for instance, can be held forever or repeated identically. It's an instrument played on an instrument, and yet the performer is human. This false unity perfectly conveys the duality between Laura's nature and what she longs for. But much as the ocean cannot exist on land, Laura cannot be human. And this newfound urge intensifies as she changes her behavior, for example, freeing the deformed man. The visual play with mirrors, light, and the imagery of the fly all point towards this internal crisis and her longing for freedom and rebirth. When Laura breaks away from her original purpose, the fog echoes the film's title sequence, resurfacing this idea of creation. It feels like a sensory rebirth, a step through the looking glass, both muted and blind. And so for the next 20 minutes, she wanders, attempting to be human. It's interesting that for this portion of her journey, there is no music in the film. Instead, the volume of her environment is heightened. The bus, the rain, the wind. The viewing experience is exceptionally sensory, bringing to life that feeling of discovery that Laura is going through. But unfortunately, her identity is not governed by her wants or needs. Everything from the banality of eating cake to physical intimacy and love is impossible. And because of this, her very existence becomes unclear. Laura's character falls in a deep state of limbo as she heads into the forest, which serves to illustrate her mind state. Everything from the density of the trees to the treacherous footing and sharp branches emphasizes hostility and confusion, much akin to the tangled mess that is her existence. She repeatedly blends with her twisting environment, reinforcing this notion that the forest is also within her. And amidst this lonely introspection, a logger appears, first friendly.
Watch out, you step here, it's a bit slippery.
And then as a villain. The reveal of his true colors is marked by the film's final song. This one is perhaps the most interesting one in the film, as it manages to reconcile conflicting emotions by juxtaposing previous elements of the film's score. We first recognize the breathy strings interlaced with the culminating violence on screen. The song this time driven by the logger's physical dominance and then confused horror as Laura's skin tears away. In her raw, broken state, the score shifts to her, uniting and distorting alongside the various pieces of her identity. The seductive drums, the alien tremolos, the warm, deeper strings, all building to a sense of peace and finality as Laura gazes into her own mask. The time signature lengthens like a fading pulse, communicating what is happening within. And through her death comes an end that, however dreadful, feels right. The score almost sings to us that it's only through death that Laura could harmonize her fragmented self. As she burns, her corpse is reduced to smoldering ash, smoke, and organic matter, transcending her former body and becoming one with the earth. So, I've heard that the ending of this film has filled people with existential dread, but I think there's something uniquely bright about Laura's journey. The idea that no matter how cold, all living beings inevitably gravitate towards empathy. Maybe it's just a crazy idea, but consider that if the paralyzed woman from the start of the film was an alien, then why would she be decommissioned? And why would Glazer have us focus on that single tear just long enough for it to hold meaning? It's probably nothing, unless you want it to be. Anyway, that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed this one. I'm Take Two, and I'll see you very soon. Thanks.